Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kara Griffith, the President and CEO of Tax Analysts. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on key energy-related tax credits and incentives. Today's event is the latest installment of Taxing Issues, our series of public discussions on tax issues. We launched this series to encourage debate on the leading tax issues of our time, and we surely will have a lot to discuss this year. We will continue to bring the tax community together with leading policymakers and experts for bipartisan discussions on the future of tax policy and administration. As always, we welcome your feedback on how we can make our webinars more useful, as well as your suggestions on future webinar topics. You can send your feedback and suggestions to events@taxanalyst.org. For those of you who would like CPE credit today, please be sure to participate in the program for at least 50 minutes and answer 3 of the poll questions that will appear throughout the webinar. They will appear on the right side of the viewing window above the comment section. To receive credit for your answers to the poll questions, you'll need to register with Pigeonhole, our interactive Q&A system, by providing your name and email. Also, please remain in the default viewing window because you will not be able to see the questions if you expand the program to full screen. The course materials, which were sent out in advance, are also available for downloading under the viewing window. And on to today's event. Now, in the pages of tax notes, we use the acronym OBBBA for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. But OBBBA is a bit of a mouthful, and it's a lot easier to read than to say, and I find it nearly impossibly hard to say over and over again. So for that reason, I'm going to try to be a bit trendy today and call it OB3, which is much easier to say, even if it does sound a tiny bit like a character from Star Wars. But in any case, let's move on. So let's talk about the bill, which President Trump signed into law on July 4. Now, during the debate over it, most of the attention was focused on what lawmakers would do about the individual income tax provisions from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that were due to expire at the end of the year. But while it addressed that problem, OB3 also made significant changes to some of the clean energy tax credits and incentives that were enacted under the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. Now, OB3 did not completely repeal the clean energy credits and incentives, but it does phase out many IRA programs that had stimulated investment and job growth in solar, wind, and electric vehicles. OB3 accelerated the repeal schedules for many renewable energy credits that the IRA expanded, including electric vehicle and residential energy incentives. It also expanded the Foreign Entity of Concern, or FEOC, restrictions, which now disallow prohibited foreign entities from receiving certain credits and prevents taxpayers that claim credits from being controlled by, making certain payments to, or receiving material assistance from a prohibited entity. The foreign entity restrictions extend to potential buyers of credits, and the transferability rules remain in effect until the credits themselves phase out. OB3 also had a significant impact on wind and solar projects. In general, it prohibited wind and solar projects that began construction after July 4 of 2026 or are placed in service after December 31 of 2027 from claiming technology-neutral tax credits. But OB3 does not prohibit projects which began construction before 2025 from claiming production tax credits or investment tax credits under sections 45 and 48. Now, having said all of that, on July 7, that is 3 days after President Trump signed OB3, he issued an executive order directing the Treasury Secretary within 45 days of the bill's enactment to take all necessary action to, and I quote, strictly enforce the termination of the clean electricity production and investment tax credits under sections 45Y and 48E, end quote, for wind and solar facilities. Safe harbors are not to apply unless a substantial portion of the facility had already been built. Treasury issued guidance on August 15, which indicated that the 5% safe harbor was eliminated for large-scale wind and solar projects. Still, OB3 retained the transferability of credits, provided a new location-based bonus credit for certain nuclear facilities, offered new life to fuel cell credit eligibility, and made the Section 45Z clean fuel production credit more available. All in all, OB3 marked a fundamental shift in energy policy that is guaranteed to affect investors, developers, manufacturers, and anyone who plays in the renewables sector. Now, it wasn't surprising that President Trump turned away from renewable energy in favor of firm dispatchable sources like coal and other fossil fuels. But as we can see with all the changes that I've discussed, OB3 has wider implications for clean energy, manufacturing, and far beyond. So how will these changes affect federal revenue over the next year? And how will companies react to these changes? Well, we have an outstanding panel today to address these issues and many others. First, we have Lauren Collins. She's a partner in the tax practice of Vinson and Elkins, and she represents clients in financing, disposition, and acquisition of renewable energy products. Next, Adam Michel is the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on the economic and budgetary effects of taxation in the United States. And we have Stephanie Detterding. He's a Managing Director on the Markets and Transactions team at Crux, where she leads the company's support of transfer credit buyers. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's going to be a great conversation. So now, I started with saying it was largely anticipated that we had a Republican Congress, we have a Republican president. They were going to look to scale back on those the green credits that were part of President Biden's IRA. So on the one hand, it's hard to be surprised, but on the other hand, I'm very interested in hearing if this was what you expected. So Lauren, let me start with you. Was OB3 what you expected in terms of the limitations that it put on green credits and incentives?
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, it would depend on when you asked about my expectation because it changed dramatically throughout the beginning of the year. There were times where I thought we were going to lose every single green incentive. We were going to lose the ability to transfer. And then there was times where there was glimmer of hope and we were seeing different proposals coming out of the House and the Senate and chairman's marks and things coming out of committee. And it really was kind of all over the place throughout the legislative process. And you did a great job describing up front some of those changes. At the end of the day, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some things are better than we expected. Transferability, for example, remains largely intact. Fuel cells have new life. Clean fuels have an extension. So there's things that are positive in relation to my expectations. And then there's things that are kind of in line with expectations in terms of wind and solar being haircut pretty significantly. And then things that were made much more challenging that I don't think anyone could have really expected. I think everyone knew there might be some sort of FEOC limitations included in the bill, but the breadth and scope and the challenges in administering these restrictions is far beyond what I expected at the beginning of the year. And as we're seeing in practice, is even far worse than what we saw when we had the final legislation.
So we're definitely going to come back and spend some time on the FEOC, on those restrictions, because it's quite interesting. But before we get there, Adam, I'm going to turn to you. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the intent. And so how did we end up where we are? And are you satisfied with where we are in terms of what you were hoping for on the credits being scaled back?
Yeah, thanks. I think Lauren's comments are important, that there was this sort of seesaw back and forth about where they ultimately would land. I ultimately think that we got more IRA repeal than I would have predicted before the debate really dug in, but we didn't get nearly as much as I would have liked to have seen. But to your question on what was trying to be accomplished here, the first part was the first goal was revenue, right? These credits were effectively uncapped. They were open-ended. They were projected to cost as much as $5 trillion over the next several decades. And so putting caps on these subsidies was a big goal in and of itself. They were also sold initially as green jobs programs, as industrial policy to remake the energy sector, as carbon abatement, and they failed on all of these fronts. They were inefficient jobs programs. They ultimately are costing somewhere between $2 and $7 million per job created. They were failed industrial policy. If you look back at the sort of Biden industrial policy spending in the CHIPS Act and the IRA, about 40% of those projects were either were stalled or fully ended before Trump's tariff policies sort of disrupted even more of them. And then they were costly carbon abatement strategy. If you look at the social cost of carbon estimates from the Biden administration, they were inflated themselves. The IRA spending was many times higher than those estimates, meaning it was an inefficient use of fiscal resources, even if that is your ultimate goal. So I would have liked to have seen them go further, but I think for sort of all of these reasons, the scaling back of these credits was long overdue.
Stephanie, my initial sense is going to be that you'll disagree with Adam on some of those points, but I want to get your first blush on whether there was anything in the bill that surprised you or disappointed you, and sort of your general take on the overall bill.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Lauren and Adam as far as you went kind of up and down with what the impact was going to be and what you were hearing, I think, in the market. During this time, Crux actually hired a head of policy. And so we were fortunate in that he was spending time on Capitol Hill every single day. And so I felt like we were very in the know on proposed changes and timing. If you would have told me in January that something would have been finalized by July 4th, I probably would not have believed you. I think I thought that this was going to be complicated, that there was going to be continued back and forth. I honestly still thought that in the month of June. And so the fact that they were able to get something done by July 4th, that did surprise me. There were, even in the draft bills, there were good things that actually helped the market be able to continue to get transferable deals done. One of the big pieces of uncertainty at the beginning of the year was, would this legislation have retroactive implications? That was a major topic in the industry. It halted and stalled certain transactions and was a pretty common topic of conversation. And so, I was glad to see that there wasn't any retroactivity in the draft bills or in the final legislation. Disappointed around the implications for solar and wind, but I think that the disappointment likely comes from the fact that we are looking at the most recent legislation being the Inflation Reduction Act, which honestly, that is more of an anomaly in the renewable space, that there was this 10-year runway. In fact, if you maybe look, while solar wind credits have been around for a long time, a lot of time those developers were dealing with, a few years of runway under the legislation. So this environment, while I think there's new challenges to deal with, it's not necessarily totally unfamiliar to them and trying to navigate some of these new strategies.
That's interesting. One question, and then I want to turn back to Adam for another. You mentioned having the importance of having someone on Capitol Hill. We have guidance that should be coming out sometime in the near term. How important do you think it is to have representation on Capitol Hill? Like, should taxpayers be going? I've seen that advice given a few times in other areas. How important is it to go and really lobby for what you want?
I think it's very important. I would probably say that it matters, in your actual local areas, maybe even more, rather than being on Capitol Hill, but what is actually happening in your backyard, specifically, and going to your local representatives and starting there. I think for purposes of what Crux was focused on at the federal level, it was very helpful to have someone on Capitol Hill, but I would probably say, maybe start locally first, Kara, and, focus your efforts there.
Interesting.
And,
Thank
and
you.
you can also start with your local, not local, but your kind of industry specific trade groups. Some of those groups were incredibly effective at talking to lawmakers, explaining some of the challenges in the legislation that had been proposed and getting fixes. And I know a lot of them are still active in terms of talking to Treasury about what future guidance is going to look like. And it seems like that's been a pretty interactive and successful conversation.
And you would hope it is, because you look at how complicated the fiat restrictions are, and it takes an expert. And so I'm always glad to hear that there is a back and forth with almost all tax issues in general. So Adam, you mentioned revenue, and I think we all knew that one of the pay-fors for OB3 was going to be the repeal of some of these credits. It was sort of the writing was on the wall pretty soon. But what impact do you think the repeal of the credits is going to have on federal revenue, maybe in the near term and a few years out?
Yeah, you're right that the need for revenue in this process was one of the forcing mechanisms that really tied Congress's hands, where they had to repeal a large portion of these subsidies. It was the sort of one of the easiest pay-fors on the tax side, and so JCT estimates that over the 10-year budget window, these repeals will raise about $500 billion of revenue. That's about half of the IRA subsidy. If you'll remember back, when it was passed, JCT said that the IRA credits would cost, I think it was like $270 billion over 10 years, and that number then crept up as new estimates came out. Third-party private sector estimates sort of confronted them on those low numbers, and it ended up being about $1 trillion cost over 10 years, and significantly more over time because the credits were effectively uncapped and open-ended. But I think what's often lost in the revenue conversation is the fact that if Congress actually sticks to the phase-outs that they put in these credits, there'll be even more savings, even additional revenue from the repeal of these credits outside the budget window, because a lot of the phase-outs are happening within the 10-year scorable period. We should expect even bigger savings outside that 10-year window, and that's where the real benefit is, and should that point should keep Congress from, I hope, coming back and undoing a lot of the progress that was made here.
So let's jump in and start talking about the impact, I don't know, let's say administration of these. Lauren, what do you make of the executive order that was issued? Did we learn anything from that executive order, or was it just trying to put a timeline around when we might see guidance, although that timeline has since passed? What do you make of it?
Yeah, what I think I make most of that executive order is just, frankly, how quickly it came out following the legislation passage. I was surprised. It certainly reaffirmed that President Trump is serious about restricting certain renewable development, and was kind of putting out an executive order with a clear directive on certain items, namely putting a beginning of construction guidance package out for wind and solar, and more clear guidance out for the prohibited foreign entity of concern type rules. And then we saw that executive order being responded to by Treasury even sooner than the 45 days that I believe he had originally set out, at least for the beginning of construction. So the main thing it showed me was that, the executive branch is motivated to make these changes and get them implemented, and then Treasury is responding in kind. I do think once you see the guidance that came out of Treasury around beginning of construction, it was nowhere near as restrictive or as inflammatory, frankly, as some of the words on the page in the executive order, which I think we all found a huge relief. But it did show that they were paying attention. There was some, working in concert and then responding in real time, which was frankly really helpful for the industry. As much as we may not like some of these changes, having the certainty of the rules makes things just easier to administer and make sure that the right transactions are getting done.
I feel like certainty is just always a constant, and nearly every tax scenario, it is, businesses want to know how they're supposed to respond, what are the rules by which we're playing, and then they like to move forward. Stephanie, what are you seeing? Has there been a reaction in the industry from the executive order?
Yeah, I think where we sit now, Lauren's exactly right. The executive order came out quick and just inserted uncertainty again into the market for these developers. And I think there was a short pause until the notice came out. I think people were being advised to continue operating under kind of the traditional begun construction rules, but people weren't certain that that was going to work until the notice came out. I think where the market sits now, we are in a much better place for the exact reason you just said, Kara, certainty. And so we are seeing that developers are implementing the begun construction rules. And, the EO and the notice, did away with the 5% safe harbor, but I don't know that a lot of developers were actually relying on that. It's an expensive way to satisfy the begun construction rules. And so the physical work test, I think, is in line with a lot of what developers are already doing. There's new rules and whatnot, but they should be able to implement the strategies that they've had in the past. I think what they will still and are having to navigate is FIAC and maybe obtaining materials from non-FIAC suppliers to the extent that they are able. And we do expect some supply chain strife for people trying to satisfy begun construction. And so they'll work through that. And Lauren, honestly, I'm curious if you have had discussions where maybe people aren't able to secure transformers, for example, to satisfy, physical work test, and if we're going to see maybe some new strategies that have not been employed in the past.
Yeah, no secrets I'm willing to share on that, but for certain we are seeing that transformers, which are kind of a favored way of satisfying the significant physical work test, you're limited by the supply chain, and that's certainly not the only way that you can begin construction. Any sort of on-site physical work or off-site manufacturing of non-inventory components are great ways to begin construction. And as you said, Stephanie, kind of better for many folks than the 5% safe harbor. So, the notice was kind of much ado about nothing. And we are finding there's all sorts of other creative strategies and solutions to utilize the significant physical work test to begin construction for wind and solar prior to summer of next year. So Adam, you may hate to hear this, but we're going to have wind and solar development, going strong through the next year. And then that gives us another 4+ years of runway for wind and solar.
Yeah, that's exactly my takeaway from the guidance so far as well, is that it's much too industry friendly. If you go back to the history of where the EO came from, there was some consternation, particularly among House Republicans, in voting for the final bill because they felt like it didn't go far enough in repealing a lot of these credits. So the EO was a part of an agreement with the White House to then, through regulatory interpretation, try to correct some of what they saw as last-minute changes to the repeal of these credits and the beginning of construction language. And so the EO, I agree, had some really great, strong rhetoric in it, but ultimately the regulations that followed up didn't back that up with action. And so I know we're going to get to the FIAC rules in a minute, but my fear is that we're going to see something similar there, is that the dog barks a lot louder than its bite.
Yeah, and I think maybe the only thing I would follow up on there, Adam, with the notice, I do think with the notice, they did try to put parameters around the physical work test a little bit tighter than maybe what parties were doing in the past, just signing contracts potentially or putting forth payments. And so I do think that with the notice, they're really trying to nail down true physical work that is happening and get more granular there, if that provides you any sort of comfort.
Adam, do you have any sense of when we might be seeing guidance? I suspect that no one does, but it's worthy of asking.
I don't have any inside knowledge on when we'll get the FIOC guidance. They're behind schedule as it is. As many folks are aware, there's a sort of footnote in the guidance we do have saying they're working on it. And I guess the joke is we should expect it to come on a Friday in the afternoon, and probably a Friday that will be soon.
I think that's a good bet. Lauren, let's move on to the FIAC restrictions. We've danced around it a little bit. Before we get into how complicated they are and what they do, can you just run us through some of the basics on the new restrictions?
Sure. Yeah, I'll certainly try. They are very complicated, as you mentioned. And I think Tax Analyst was kind enough to provide folks with some slides and materials that have some of these details laid out, because it's a topic that you could spend hours on and still not fully grasp the full breadth of how these rules work. And if we could throw up, there was one slide. There we go. Awesome. So this is just meant to kind of show a snapshot of some of these rules as they apply to the tech neutral credits. The prohibited foreign entity restrictions, or the kind of colloquially called FIOC restrictions, they apply really to all of the IRA tax credits in some way, shape, or form. So if you're looking at a tax credit in this space, you have to be mindful of these rules. The main exception being our original Section 45 PTC and Section 48 ITC. As Stephanie noted, there was no retroactive change in OB3. So this is really just kind of a go forward looking set of restrictions. And you can kind of put them in a few different buckets. The first is what folks are referring to as like a material assistance restriction. This is essentially the inverse of any sort of domestic content bonus. So instead of saying if you manufacture so many pieces of components of a facility in the US and you get a bonus credit, this says if you are manufacturing or using components from certain covered nations, then you lose the credit entirely. And those covered nations are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Obviously, China is really one of the main focus areas here, but you can't forget about the other three as well. The other bucket is restrictions on ownership, control, and debt. This is really looking at who is the taxpayer that's going to be claiming the credit, and do they run up against one of these restrictions? Do they have someone in their ownership chain that is going to taint their status and cause them to be treated as a prohibited foreign entity? And it's easy to kind of think about this as, oh, FIOCs, right? These are terrorist organizations. These are companies that have posed some threat to national security. But it's not that simple, unfortunately. It extends to any company that is domiciled or has a principal place of business in one of these nations. It extends to citizens of these nations, and it extends to companies or entities that are controlled by these types of folks. So if you have an entity that is 51% owned by another Chinese company, that lower tier entity in and of itself has become a prohibited foreign entity that can lose the credit. So it requires a pretty in-depth analysis of an ownership structure chart. It requires application of 318A2 attribution. And for renewable tax lawyers in this space, we don't spend a lot of time in 318A2, but we sure have now, because you really need to understand the intricacies of those rules to figure out if they apply. And similarly for debt, you have to look at the debt holdings of the taxpayer. Have they issued more than 15% of their debt in the aggregate to a Chinese lender? That's really one of the main situations we're seeing. And that can be a pretty easy thing to just trip into inadvertently. So lots of traps for the unwary in that particular limitation. The other one is on restrictions for effective control payments. This is where you have to essentially look at, as the taxpayer, who do you make payments to, and does that counterparty have a level of effective control over the facility you'd like to claim a credit on? This can be your O&M providers, this can be your suppliers, this can be folks that are providing warranties to you. Any IP licenses you might have obtained, let's say, for example, from a Chinese company, any of those can be problematic and cause you to lose your tax credit. So that's another area where you have to be extremely mindful. And then there's a new 10-year recapture period. If you've played in the ITC space, you're very familiar with the 5-year ITC recapture. It steps down over time, and it essentially relates to the facility ceasing to be eligible for the ITC or being transferred. This new 10-year recapture period is obviously twice as long as what we've lived with, so it creates financing uncertainties. It also doesn't step down over time, so it's a full 100% ITC recapture. And it essentially would kick in anytime you make one of these types of effective control payments to anyone. So again, it's looking at your contractual counterparties and understanding any sort of control they may have over the facility. So I'll stop there in terms of overview, but just noting that it's like barely scratching the surface of some of these rules. And obviously, please reach out to your V&E tax attorneys if you'd like to get into it in any more detail.
Yeah, there's a lot there. That's going to be a whole new process that's going to have to go through just to make sure that you're either checking or not checking, depending on how you think about it, checking the box. Stephanie, I want to get your thoughts on the new fiat restrictions. What are you seeing in response to them?
Yeah, this is definitely a main topic of discussion, Kara. We are still actively seeing kind of the legacy investment tax credits and the production tax credits. So this is more prospectively looking and trying to figure out how you are going to satisfy the fiat rules. As you mentioned earlier, I predominantly deal with buyers of these credits, and they have some fiat rules that they will have to work through and make sure that they qualify, but we don't expect them to have major issues or prohibit them from purchasing credits generally. Typically, buyers purchase credits after the credits are generated. And I highlight that because while these rules are complicated, and there are still pieces of these that we don't know, buyers are going to be able to have their advisors at the table and do their due diligence and be comfortable with these fiat restrictions before they ever pay for a tax credit. And so buyers, I think, are going to be able to get comfortable with the credit they're purchasing and whether or not there are fiat concerns kind of upfront. I do think that the recapture that Lauren mentioned over 10 years, that is significant. That is something that is new that the industry, I think, is going to have to wrap their heads around. And, when we look at these deals and we see transactions happening, a lot of the ways that counterparties get comfortable with the underlying transaction is the strength of a guarantor or a sponsor, right? Or insurance. Insurance is very common in the transfer credit market. And I think when we have uncertainty in legislation and we don't know how certain requirements are going to be enforced, it's hard to say that you're going to have that credit support necessarily from insurance, which I think has helped deals and transactions get done. So this is more of a long-winded way of saying I think that buyers will have time to get comfortable before they ever purchase credits, but there's still a lot of unknown, and not only unknown as far as the rules go, but also then is insurance going to be able to step in and how are they going to react? Because that's been such a major part of these transfer credit deals and honestly, even in tax equity transactions.
And I'll just add, I agree with Stephanie that for the vast majority of taxpayers, these rules are not going to apply. It's really just a matter of how do you prove it and how do you diligence it. And that's where we hope that guidance will really help out by providing some clear pathways for taxpayers to establish they don't trip up these rules. And that can be relying on certifications from counterparties. It can be de minimis rules in terms of ownership. limitations on the timing of the debt issuance I described. There's all sorts of other ways that they could come up with, easy ways, not easy ways, it won't be easy, but, at least reasonable ways in which taxpayers can prove their compliance with these restrictions.
Right. So I guess if there is a process by which you can say you're going through these steps, then that does somehow make it better. Adam, I want to get your thoughts on the FIAC restrictions as well. We sort of know that one of the intents of OB3 in general and the FIAC rules too is to get towards an elimination of these tax credits. Did the FIAC rules go far enough? And a secondary question for you as well is, could this have been done in a simpler fashion? So those are, I was going to ask that as a follow-up, but I'll throw it out first and see if you can bundle that in there.
Yeah, no, I think you preempted where I was going to go with my answer, and that's the ideal policy is to just repeal the credits. I think in a lot of, while the FIAC restrictions have this sort of anti-China, protecting our supply chain motive behind them, at least on paper, working through the process that they were sort of tightened and made more complex as they needed to squeeze more revenue out of the repeal. And this is a sort of easier backdoor way of getting revenue out of the repeal process without changing some of the bigger components that might get a little bit more pushback through the political process. And so I do think it's unfortunate that we're here with incredibly complex rules as one way of scaling back the credits. I much would have rathered a straight repeal or a more accelerated phase out. But since we are here, to the extent that the Treasury guidance can make these rules as onerous as possible, I think that's for the better. The goal should be to make sure these credits are hard to get, and that they're putting in meaningful penalties for sort of going outside the bounds of what's available. Expanded scrutiny, sort of up and down supply chains, in component parts, are all ways that you could sort of tighten up these rules and ensure that they're putting more restrictions rather than fewer on access to these credits. So we'll see what's in the guidance and how far they go. But that would be my goal if I were putting together the sort of final regs here.
It will be interesting to see what ultimately comes out. I always think it's much nicer if we can do it in a simple way, but sometimes it's just simply not possible. Stephanie, let's move on a little bit and talk about some of the specific tax credit code changes. Would you want to summarize for us some of the key changes in the Section 45Y and 48E clean energy credits?
Yeah, and I believe I had slides for this that are also in the materials. But yeah, great. Thank you for pulling those up. And, we just talked about the fact that there are some legacy credits that are still transacting. And these tech neutral credits, they were meant to really focus not on specific technologies, but really a reduction in greenhouse emissions. And with the OB3, you can see on this slide that there's a phase out for these credits earlier than was in place under the Inflation Reduction Act. So prior to OB3, it was likely that these credits would be around till at least 2035 or even further, depending on greenhouse gas emission reduction. For the ITC, Section 48E, other changes to highlight, energy storage, it still remains eligible for the credit on its own, even if it is tied to a wind or solar facility. Worth noting that, we are seeing an uptick in storage deals in all of our data. Credits for solar water heaters or wind residential or rural leases are immediately eliminated, but solar leases remain eligible. And then starting at the end of this year, fuel cells automatically are eligible without needing to actually prove greenhouse gas emission rates less than 0 and without recapture. And then we've already kind of talked significantly about the FIAC restrictions, but that's really going to be the major changes that you're going to see with these tech neutral credits, right? Is that the FIAC rules are going to apply, and when do they apply for your specific project? And then obviously we've talked about the executive order and the implication to solar and wind. I think on the next slide, we get into the production tax credit, tech neutral PTC. And, again, here you can see that there is an earlier phase out than we had under the Inflation Reduction Act. And we also have to deal with the FIAC rules. But there was a 10% bonus credit for advanced nuclear facilities built in for communities with large numbers of people employed in nuclear related industries. I think if you are thinking about winners and losers, maybe under OB3, nuclear is probably a winner there, and it shows up here as well.
So I'm going to just add in a follow-up question that came from an audience question. Do you think there will be a push for new credits for other energy sources? You mentioned nuclear. This says like micronuclear anytime soon?
I don't know. I think that there already has been a push for new technologies since the Inflation Reduction Act, and we see that playing out in the data and in the transactions and in the composition of the market related to transactions actually get completed. I think that we see a lot of transfer credit deals and tax equity traditionally have preferred or stuck with solar and wind. And I just highlighted, right, that you see now storage really being popular. And with the IRA, 45X, the advanced manufacturing credits, those are an incredibly popular credit. So are the 45U production tax credits. And we do see new technologies entering the marketplace and people transacting. I do think that whether or not there's demand for those kinds of transactions will be dependent also on the supply related to some of these other traditional technologies. I think that in discussions that we're having out in the market and whatnot, there is a thought that if some of these more traditional technologies are not generating credits, which technologies then do you start to look to, and which ones are you going to educate yourself on and get comfortable with? And I think that really will be the discussion, and I don't know that I have a prediction for what future supply is necessarily going to look like based on some of the topics we've already covered about supply constraints for solar and wind.
I think it's incredibly hard to predict the future on some of this. Lauren, how are your clients reacting? Are people starting to prepare for the new FIAC restrictions, some of these limitations in general? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I'll reiterate what Stephanie said in terms of our investor client base. They are planning on doing solar and wind and other traditional renewable energy investments for at least the next few years, but are starting to look at other types of technologies. Storage is an obvious one, fuel cells, as has been mentioned, nukes, and trying to figure out which of those they might get approval to invest with respect to, and whether it's worth their time to learn about those technologies and basically put together a product where they'd be investing in those technologies. For our developer clients, the folks that are actually out there developing these facilities, the main focus in the short term is going to be beginning construction. For wind and solar especially, they have the cliff date of next summer. but also for really most of these technologies who don't want to be subject to the material assistance requirements. If they begin construction this year, they can avoid those limitations. So there's a big focus on finding ways to establish beginning construction this year. But we're also spending a lot of times with clients thinking through the PFE rules, figuring out how to diligence them, as we've talked about, what level of diligence is really required. And there's also certain areas in the legislation that will undoubtedly be kind of cleaned up with guidance. So it's trying to make some calls about, should we take the most conservative reading on this particular question, or do we think it'll be cleaned up and there'll be a more reasonable pathway? But I am seeing clients trying to figure it out in real time, looking at their structures, looking at their supply chains as well. Folks are starting to think, can we source components from a non-Chinese company? And is that, possible given the technology? Sometimes not. That's just the reality of the supply chain for certain technologies. And if that's the case, then starting to run the numbers and figuring out how disastrous it's going to be in terms of credit qualification.
It is interesting in the past 9 months how many times supply chains have now come into the tax space. It's just, I find that we're talking more and more. You start thinking about adding, customs lawyers into the mix on tax conversation, and it's an interesting new spin, right?
Yeah, and we have.
It definitely is an interesting new spin. Adam, I want to pose another audience question to you, which dovetails with one that I had wanted to ask you. How do you see OB3 reshaping the long-term stability of the clean energy tax credit market in the U.S.?
I guess I'll maybe reformulate that to how do I think it will impact the clean energy market in general. I think the sort of market for the tax credits, to the extent that the credits go away, will sort of fall away with these as the credits themselves phase out, which is the sort of the ultimate goal. But I think a lot of the rhetoric around these changes being the sort of end of renewable energy, or a reorientation towards fossil fuels instead of renewable energy, is sort of a wrong framing of what's going on here. What I think is going to happen is ultimately will make the renewable energy sector more resilient. We know that industries that are built on the back of federal subsidies are brittle and are not able to compete internationally in a way that is sustainable. And so, to the extent that we can wean our industries off of federal support, it'll ultimately make them stronger. It will mean that only projects that can stand on their own right will go forward. And that will mean that some companies or projects that were only put together to access these tax shelters will not go forward. But that's a good thing. That will make the market stronger, and it ultimately puts consumers in the driver's seat to demand the type of energy that they want and that the market demands, rather than these credits and politicians in Washington choosing the energy mix that ultimately gets delivered.
And I'll disagree in part and surprisingly agree with one piece of this. I think the renewable energy industry is not brittle at all, and it's actually incredibly resilient, as has been shown over the past few decades, and just the incredible amount of investment and development we've seen. I also think that, to partially agree, the energy needs in this country are so great, and particularly when you think about AI and data centers, and just, you look at those graphs, we're going to need all sorts of energy. It should be all hands on deck. So I agree the renewable energy industry is going to continue on even as these credits start to fall away.
It's a very good point.
To build on that, we've been hearing for decades now, since the since the wind and solar credits were first entered the tax code as temporary credits, that these industries just need the credits for a couple of years to get on their feet, and then then they'll be competitive and the credits can phase out as intended. And then each year during as the phase out gets closer, we get this renewed argument that they just need them for another several years. And so I believe the industry when they say that they didn't need these credits to stand on their own feet, and that the original phase outs were not the end of the world. And so I think that we'll see a much more resilient energy market if Congress can stick to their word and actually let these ones phase out.
So I want to talk a little bit about the market right now for buying tax credits. I think we're talking about the fact that it likely has softened and then may continue. Stephanie, you're in this space quite a lot. What are you seeing, and what do you think the future holds for the tax credit market?
Yeah, so the first half of 25, based on our data, we believe that the transfer credit market was around 20 billion, which is, I think, 2 times what we have for the first half of 2024. So that's a significant volume of transfer credits, especially in light of policy uncertainty. I think that the other thing that the data shows is, again, a diversification among technologies. So not just wind and solar, but biogas and RNG, storage, nuclear, advanced manufacturing. So we are seeing that some of the new technologies and different code sections, people are transacting in those areas. And I think that will continue if you kind of look from when the IRA was first passed until now. The diversification of the technologies has increased. All of that being said, one thing that we didn't touch on with OB3, and there's obviously other tax provisions, but there were extensions of the TCG Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax provisions, and corporates have additional deductions, expenses that maybe they were not planning for post OB3. And not only maybe is their tax liability reduced, their calculations are complicated, and they are digesting OB3. And so we have seen a softening in the market. We think the low point will be kind of this third quarter of the year in buyer demand, right? Because they may not have the tax appetite, but most likely they also are just busy recalculating their tax liability and projecting. We do know that there is a seasonality to these markets, and we expect kind of Q4 more normalized demand as buyers have a line of sight on their tax liability. I also know that in working with a lot of buyers of tax credits, some who had not entered the space prior to this year, and when there was legislative uncertainty, were unsure if maybe they wanted to enter the space and kind of educate themselves on the market. And since having the OB3 legislation in place and seeing that transferability is preserved for most technologies through the decade, I think we will see those groups enter the space, and they can use these credits as a tax planning tool, but also I think they can use this in connection with sustainability goals and other kind of ESG incentives if they want to plan.
I mean, without a doubt, you have to imagine the corporate space is certainly reeling from some additional complexities, multiple calculations going in. So I could certainly see that having an impact. Lauren, what is your take on the market for tax credits going forward?
Yeah, as kind of touched on, we are seeing impacts from reduced tax rates and from kind of the permanent extension of bonus depreciation. That's another really important change from OB3 and is impacting tax capacity across the market. So we are seeing buyers change their decision making or pause and figure out what their tax capacity is actually going to look like. But it's still like incredibly busy. We are doing lots of transfer deals. It feels like every couple days we're getting a new term sheet. They're also really efficient transactions, unlike tax equity, complicated and requires a lot of structuring. Transfer transactions are efficient. They work quickly and easily, and the market has really developed incredibly fast. So I expect that those transactions will continue. And even if the volume softens a little bit, there's still plenty of work to be done.
Yeah, undoubtedly, it's going to be a busy rest of this year and all of next year in the tax space. I think all of us will have plenty of work to do. Adam, I want to turn to localities for a moment. We talked about initially where we were mentioning on lobbying, and maybe the best place to start is your local or your municipal trade group. Many localities have initiatives that focus on renewable energy. How should municipalities respond to what's going on?
My recommendation to them is to follow, to the extent the federal response moved in this direction, eliminating these programs that distort the market. That just like at the federal level, we shouldn't have tax credits for solar or wind or whatever other politically popular energy sources out there. It's also not a good use of the fiscal resources of state or local governments. But to the extent that the most local level of government is most responsive to the people living there, if that's what they want to spend their fiscal resources on, I would much rather it happen at the state or local level than the federal level. But broadly speaking, the energy prices will be lower and energy grids will be more stable if we're not putting our thumb on the scale of intermittent energy sources and sources that are otherwise uncompetitive without subsidies.
Stephanie, have you seen any change in what is happening at the local level? We're talking about things at the federal level, and there's a lot going on. What types of changes have you seen, if any, at the local level?
We have not seen or heard of any significant changes at the local level. I think that overall, and I mentioned that I was just at a renewable energy conference. I think there were over 40,000 attendees, and so had lots of discussions myself and among the team and whatnot. And we're not hearing a lot of local kind of pushback. In fact, I would say on the local level and kind of pre OB3, a lot of the discussion was that in the local areas, these projects were being supported, right? And they were helpful for the local communities and helping with electricity costs, and there was job creation. And so if anything, we've probably heard positive things as it relates to localities.
That's interesting. Well, in our final 3-ish minutes or so, I'm going to pose this to each of you if you have an answer. Do you expect there to be any rollbacks in the future? So, if we look to a new administration, and how are businesses going to respond to that? Are they counting on the fact that there will be rollbacks? Lauren, maybe I'll start with you on this question and seeing what your clients are saying. Is there an expectation that, or a hope that there will be a new administration 3 years and a few months from now, and we'll see something different and we'll get a rollback of these?
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, it's the opposite expectation, that if there's a new administration, we'd see things getting extended. But I don't know that there's even necessarily that hope. I don't think folks are really betting on that. I personally think that the uncertainty and the changing of the guard, which is resulting in massive changes to credits, is creating just too much uncertainty. And to the extent, even if what we have to live with is OB3, better to at least know the shape of the table and create investment certainty, which is kind of been the theme of this hour.
Yeah. Certainty is always the theme going forward. Stephanie, I'm interested, what are your hopes for the future in terms of what you're seeing? Are you satisfied with where we are, or would you like to see something different? Are you there?
Apologies.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, Kara, I'm so sorry, your sound cut out for me.
Oh, no worries. I was just asking sort of your thoughts for the future. If you were, if you've got clients that are expecting rollbacks, hoping for rollbacks, or if you're sort of like Lauren, kind of satisfied, and what you want to know is what is the state of play today?
Yes, definitely in the category of wanting, to know the state of play and have some certainty. We are not kind of currently expecting major changes, at least through the remainder of this Congress. And beyond that, I think it's hard to predict. I think it sounds like, and Adam, keep me honest here, but that, we all do recognize that there are increasing energy costs and, rapidly growing electricity load. And so I think that it's possible, depending on what the next administration looks like, that, to Lauren's point, some of these incentives could be extended.
Yeah, and I'll wrap up with echoing that, but that being sort of my greatest fear is that a future administration undoes the progress that was made here. The history of these credits having phase outs is that they come back or that they're extended. OB3 set up a bunch of tax cliffs in the future. A lot of the individual provisions expire at the end of 2028. And so you can sort of see how a package starts coming together that ties no tax on tips with extending a bunch of green energy subsidies. And so I think protecting against that future is what I'm looking out for.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining today. Really appreciate your thoughts. Thank you to the audience for listening and for engaging with questions. This was very informative, and I look forward to the next one. Have a great day, everyone.